Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history helps you drift into sleep. Imagine standing in the eerie silence of the battlefield, the smoke still hanging heavy in the air. Hours ago, these fields echoed with cannon fire and shouted orders, but now only the distant cries of the defeated remain. Tonight, we sit beside a dwindling fire. A weary man, once at Napoleon's side, writes his final letter. Not to a general, but to a friend. He's asking the same questions we hear in the hush of history. What does it mean to serve a fallen emperor? And how do you say goodbye to a man who once held all of Europe in his grasp? This isn't a tale of conquest, but of farewell, of loyalty, regret, and the quiet courage of letting go. If you enjoy being carried gently through time, subscribe and let history whisper you to sleep. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it? Did this story help you unwind? Now, cozy up by the fire. Feel its warmth on your face. Let the soft glow quiet your thoughts. Take a deep breath. Let the story begin. The battlefield feels impossibly large tonight, stretched wide beneath the heavy sky. What light remains comes only from the moon and a few stubborn fires fighting to live. Smoke still hangs like a gauzy veil over everything, carrying with it the smell of scorched earth and gunpowder. There is no glory in this place anymore. No hint of the bold banners or shining cavalry that had charged across it just hours earlier. Now the mud clutches at boots and wheels, broken cannon wheels, and shattered planks lying half buried in craters where shells had hit their marks. The air is still, except for the occasional sharp call of a wounded soldier carried on the wind. I sit hunched by a fire, its warmth only enough to fight back the worst of the raw chill that has settled in. My coat hangs heavy on my shoulders, damp with sweat from the battle and the cold drizzle that started as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Everything is cold now, the earth beneath me, the night air around me, even the knowledge resting heavy in my chest. This was no ordinary defeat. I know it. Every man who survived today knows it. What seemed untouchable, an empire carved from brilliance and ambition, lies on this same darkened field in ruins. And with it, the man who created it. The fire pops softly, and in its faint glow, I watch the embers rise and flicker before disappearing into the blackness above. Across from me, a shattered saber lies forgotten in the dirt, its once polished blade catching the moonlight with a dull gleam. It reminds me of the charge earlier this afternoon, when the cavalry thundered forward, swords raised, into the storm of musket fire. I saw it clearly from the ridge. Hundreds of horses, their riders shouting with defiance, pushing forward through the smoke until suddenly the line faltered. It was like watching a wave break against sharp rocks. The men were forced back, retreating in chaos as the enemy advanced, and in that moment, the invincibility I had always associated with our emperor seemed to crack, letting doubts seep in. I close my eyes, but it's pointless. The day's images are still too vivid, too sharp. I can see the rows of our infantry standing resolute as cannonballs tore through their ranks. Some fell without a sound, others screaming as they crumpled to the ground. And I can hear it too, the deafening roar of artillery, the relentless drumbeat of musket volleys, the shouting of officers straining to control the chaos. Yet the most haunting sound of all is the one I now hear in its absence: silence. It presses in, heavy and unrelenting, broken only by small stirrings in the dark. A groan here, the dull scrape of metal on stone as someone drags themselves from the wreckage. This quiet has a weight to it, as if the very earth is mourning alongside us. But beyond the physical exhaustion, there is something deeper gnawing at me. For years, I'd carried such certainty about him, about us, and where we were all heading. To serve Napoleon always felt like walking in the footsteps of destiny itself. He was a man guided by something bigger than luck or skill, a force of nature with a vision so grand it pulled entire nations into its current. Today, though, that force seems spent, its strength drained away on a rain-soaked Belgian plain. And yet, here I sit, unable to untangle the loyalty that binds me to him. Even now, even after the rout and the retreat, my devotion remains intact, though it's been bruised, perhaps bent. As I stare at the dying fire, I ask myself why. Was it his brilliance that commanded such faith, the way he reshaped the art of war in ways no one had ever imagined? Or was it something simpler, something more personal, the charisma, the unwavering belief he seemed to have in himself, and strangely enough in all of us who served him? To follow him on any campaign, whether across the Alps or into the deserts of Egypt, was to feel as though you were a part of history as it was being written. But what does it mean to serve someone who has lost everything, lingers unanswered? I pick up a stick and stir the fire absent-mindedly, watching sparks leap and fade. My eyes wander to the shadows of the field, where the bodies of fallen comrades rest in uneven rows. Beside them lie the enemy dead, their uniforms and flags soiled beyond recognition. For all the trumpets and proclamations, this is how it all ends. Men robbed of names, swallowed by mud, everyone equal in the aftermath. But the worst of it isn't what I see around me, it's what I can't stop remembering. There was a moment earlier today, as the Prussians began to press on our flanks, when I caught sight of him, Napoleon. He stood atop that legendary horse of his, scanning the battlefield with a calm I could barely make sense of. He wasn't the fiery figure he'd been in his younger days, but there was still something commanding in him, something that even the crack of enemy cannon fire couldn't diminish. And still, there was no miracle, no masterstroke to salvage the day. He was mortal after all, and we were all left to face the truth. A gust of wind cuts through my coat, bringing me back to the present. The fire shrinks lower, its light barely enough now to chase the shadows that surround me. Somewhere in the distance, another groan rises, and the sound almost merges with the rustle of leaves along the edge of the woods. It sounds far too much like a sigh, as if the land itself is releasing its breath after such a long and bitter struggle. I don't know how much time passes before I shake myself from these thoughts. Minutes? Hours? It doesn't matter. My gaze drifts upward to the open sky, which is patchy with clouds but faintly lit by pale stars, and as I sit under them, I feel the full weight of what has happened, not just today, but over the years. The rise, the victories too dazzling to put into words, the moments when serving him felt like standing at the center of the world. My heart still swells at the memory of Austerlitz, when it seemed like the sun itself rose for us. But tonight, that brightness is a lifetime away. This darkness has no end in sight. I close my eyes again, trying this time to summon the warmth of those past glories. I let my mind drift to the days when the world seemed to open before us, when every village and city we marched through was a testament to what we could achieve. Serving Napoleon was never just about following orders. It was about being a part of something bigger than yourself, about knowing that at any given moment, history was unfolding before your very eyes. It was intoxicating, that sense of purpose. And now, sitting on this cold, defeated ground, I wonder if I'll ever feel it again. For a moment, an unexpected sense of peace washes over me. Perhaps it's the fatigue finally numbing my thoughts. Or maybe it's the quiet resignation that comes with knowing what's done is done. But even in this twilight air, I feel echoes of pride for what we tried to build. Of the thousands who fought beside me, and of the man who led us, fallible as he might be. My fingers tighten instinctively around the fabric of my coat as the fire sputters one last time, giving way to darkness. And with that, my thoughts shift again, almost involuntarily to those first days. To Austerlitz, to that golden morning when it all began. They called it the Sun of Austerlitz. And when I think back on it now, I can almost feel its warmth on my face again. That sun rose, not just in the sky above us, but over the entire course of history. It marked the moment when Napoleon was more than just a man, he became legend. I remember standing on that field as dawn broke, the light turning the frost-covered ground to gold, making every blade of grass shine. It was the kind of morning that fooled you into thinking the heavens themselves had blessed what was about to happen. But of course, we knew better. That brilliance wasn't luck. It was the product of weeks of preparation, of careful planning so cunning it could make the earth itself bend to his will. I remember the strategy, the precision of it all. Napoleon had seen the battlefield before any enemy soldier set foot on it. He'd mapped it in his mind, just as he did with so many others. But this time, he did something even his own generals thought reckless. He made himself weak, on purpose. He let the enemy believe we were faltering, that we were breaking apart in our desperation. I still remember the ripple of whispers the night before, as orders filtered through camp, telling us to leave the Pratzen Heights unguarded. It felt like handing them the advantage on a silver platter. To many, it seemed like madness. To him, it was opportunity. His weakness wasn't real, it was bait, and the Allies eagerly swallowed the hook. When the enemy advanced, confident they were pressing us into a corner, they didn't see the trap until it was too late. From our left, our right, and even hidden reserves lying unnoticed in the low valleys, we surged forward to envelop them. I will never forget the sight of the Pratzen Heights, empty just hours before, now alive with charging infantry and cannons executing well-rehearsed strikes. The precision of our movements was almost inhuman. 1,000 bodies seemed to share one brain that day, every step and musket fire part of a greater, invisible rhythm. But that rhythm wasn't invisible to us. We all knew whose hand was conducting it. The exuberance in the ranks was something you could feel, like the very air around us crackled with anticipation. This wasn't a battle, it was something more. Victory felt inevitable because, in Napoleon's presence, defeat never seemed like an option. Even before the fighting began, men whispered excitedly as he passed on horseback, his figure so familiar to all of us, yet so exceptional that you couldn't help but stand a little taller seeing him. He radiated confidence, not the kind that comes from arrogance, but the kind that comes from certainty. When he looked at the battlefield that morning, you could tell he had already seen its outcome, not in vague hopes, but in precise moves destined to play out exactly as he had envisioned. By mid-morning, the lines began to shift visibly in our favor, and that golden sun seemed to climb higher along with our triumph. I can still hear the echoes of the cheers as regiments passed word from one to the next. We had taken the heights, and the enemy was breaking apart. A shout here, a triumphant roar there. Each piece of good news rippled like lightning through our ranks. It wasn't just personal pride, it was collective. We weren't winning for ourselves, we were part of something greater. The soldier's version of immortality, knowing your actions would ripple far beyond your own lifetime. The discipline among our men stood out above everything else. And now I see how much of that was his doing. Napoleon's vision for an army was unlike anything the world had ever seen. He trained us not to act out of blind loyalty alone, but out of understanding. Each soldier wasn't just a cog in the machine, but understood their purpose within that machine. The drills that we muttered curses over in quieter moments suddenly made sense as we executed maneuvers with clockwork precision. When an order came down the line that day, there was no hesitation, no confusion. The sheer unity in how we moved was only possible because we had him, a leader who could make men believe they were capable of more than they thought, Ponop. It sounds strange to admit now, but even within the chaos there was beauty. The battlefield seemed alive, as contradictory as that sounds. I remember the columns of smoke rising from the cannon fire, curling upward like grey vines, twisting against the backdrop of that impossibly clear sky. The sunlight cut through it now and then, golden beams piercing the haze and lighting up soldiers' uniforms as if they were artifacts in some ancient painting. You would think moments like those are where fear would creep in, seeing men fall around you, hearing the crash of metal that signals death. But that day, it didn't feel like fear had any hold over us. It was as if his confidence, Napoleon's endless reservoir of belief, bled into every man who fought under his banners. We knew what we were doing, we knew why we were doing it, and we trusted him to see us through. As the hours stretched on, the trap tightened. The Allied forces, so certain of their upper hand in the morning, began to splinter. Some units fled, abandoning their positions in confusion. Others stood their ground longer, each one falling in turn. I'll never forget passing a field where Austrian soldiers had been overwhelmed. White uniforms marked with blood, weapons scattered everywhere, their commanders shouting orders that no one was left to follow. It wasn't just victory we had achieved, it was total domination. And for the first time in my service, I understood what it meant to see history being written in real time. Looking back, Austerlitz wasn't just a victory. It was a declaration to the rest of the world. Napoleon didn't win that day because he had more men or better guns. He won because he saw the world differently. He looked at what others called realities, terrain, numbers, the supposed rules of war, and reshaped them. To serve someone who could bend the fabric of reality in that way was exhilarating. It wasn't that Napoleon was just smarter than his opponents. It was that he believed in something larger, and being close to that belief made you feel like you were standing inside the core of a star. When the battle ended, and the full scale of our victory became clear, the French ranks erupted. The sound of it might have been deafening if not for the emotions layered beneath. It wasn't just cheers of winning, but the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been forged that day. We weren't simply soldiers. We were part of an empire that saw itself as unshakable, and Napoleon was at its center, the gravitational pull that kept us all orbiting in perfect alignment. The sun had begun to dip by the time the final shots echoed away, leaving only the steady sound of boots moving across frost-cracked ground. I remember standing quietly as the last of the prisoners were taken, my breath puffing pale clouds in the cool evening air. Around us, remnants of the day lingered. Broken muskets, tattered flags, a few untouched patches of snow, still pristine against the bloodied fields. But there was also a warmth, something intangible in the way men moved and spoke. Pride, belief, the idea that we had been part of something far greater than ourselves. That night, back at camp, the Emperor walked among us as we tended fires and shared food. He spoke to some men directly, thanking them for their part in the victory. To others, he simply nodded. It was small, but it felt enormous. To know that, even after listening to the cheers of his generals and seeing the results of his genius unfold, he still made time to pass through the ranks of those who made it all possible. Like everything he did, it was deliberate. It reminded us we were seen. In his army, whether you carried a marshal's baton or a foot soldier's musket, you were part of something that mattered. The snow hid everything at first. The charred remains of Moscow's great buildings, the soldiers who had stumbled and fallen along broken roads, even the dead horses scattered where they had collapsed from exhaustion. All of it was buried under a soft white sheet that seemed harmless in its quiet. But we learned quickly what that quiet concealed. Snow doesn't just blanket the earth, it consumes it, erases it. And as it spread over the icy plains of Russia, it swallowed the soul of the Grande Armée bit by bit, mile after mile. I had never been so cold. None of us had. It was the kind of cold that gnawed at you, burrowing under layers of fabric, crawling into your marrow. At first you tried to fight it, to wrap yourself tighter in what little clothing you had left, to move faster, to stay close to others for warmth. Eventually, the fight became too much, and that creeping frost began to feel like something that would never leave. I saw men give up entirely, many without a word. They would slow down, linger just a step too long by the roadside, and then sit. Some folded their arms, tucking their blue-coated bodies against rocks or tree stumps. I knew what would happen next. Every one of us knew. You don't stop moving in temperatures like that unless you're making a choice, whether you admit it or not. But no matter how far we marched, there was no escaping it. The wind seemed alive, eager to snap at the exposed skin of your hands or face if you dared loosen your scarf. Boots split from wear, letting the frozen ground seep in, and frostbite spread with terrifying speed. I couldn't look too long at some of the men's feet when they removed what was left of their shoes at night, if they even had shoes left. Blackened toes with skin splitting open in hard ridges, like old parchment left too close to fire, except there was no warmth to be found. For some, frostbite moved up their legs or into their fingers. It came for them slowly, piece by piece, taking little victories from their bodies until they could walk no more. We hadn't been prepared for this. We thought we would leave Moscow in triumph, laden with the spoils of victory after forcing the Russians to their knees. When we first entered the city, I remember the awe on everyone's faces. Even among the veterans, there was a moment when we couldn't quite believe we'd marched this far, to the very heart of the Tsar's domain. Moscow was sprawling, chaotic, its churches topped with domes that seemed to gleam like treasures stolen from myth. But the splendor was short-lived, as fires swept through the city in cruel waves. Napoleon had hoped to make Moscow a jewel of our conquest, a crown for the empire. Instead, it became ash in our hands, slipping through our fingers as the weeks stretched on. By the time we left, it wasn't triumph we carried with us, but exhaustion, and the bitter knowledge that we had won nothing. The retreat was chaos from the first step. Supply lines vanished. The roads we had conquered turned against us. The Russians knew their land better than us, and they used it to turn every day into a nightmare. They cut off what little provisions we had left and sent Cossack raiders to harass our columns endlessly. Those fast-moving cavalrymen were like ghosts, appearing out of the blinding flurries only to vanish again before we could mount a defense. They didn't need to crush us outright. They only had to wear us down, to remind us every day that we were hunted, that escape came at a cost we were less and less capable of paying. And then there was the hunger, always the hunger. At first, the rations were just smaller than the men had hoped. Then they were meager, barely enough to get through the next march. Eventually, there was nothing. Our wagons had either been abandoned or captured, leaving us to fend for ourselves. I saw things I never thought I'd see among soldiers, men separating from their groups to root through frozen earth, desperately hoping to find scraps buried in dirt. Those who still had rifles would shoot ravens or crows to roast over a fire, and when there was no game, no scraps to be found, the horses became our salvation and our heartbreak. The noble animals that had carried us into Moscow were now reduced to sustenance, their ribs exposed as we slaughtered them one by one. I still remember the bitter, greasy taste of horse meat, cooked hastily over whatever flame we could conjure, its warmth too fleeting to chase away the emptiness in our bellies. Napoleon remained at the head of the ranks, as he always had. Even then, there was something reassuring about the sight of him wrapped in his greatcoat, seated high on his horse. No matter how desperate things became, no matter how many of us fell along the way, he pressed on, his horse's hooves crunching through the snow. His presence had always been enough to inspire confidence before, but this time his silence weighed heavier than his commands. I watched him closely during those days, and for the first time I saw cracks, not in his authority, but in the man himself. The steel determination that carried him through past campaigns remained, but it wasn't enough to change what surrounded us. No amount of brilliance, no flash of strategy could erase the snow, the wind, or the relentless bite of starvation. The fire that had once made him untouchable now flickered against the icy breath of reality. The men noticed it too. The murmurs began quietly at first, whispers exchanged over dwindling firelight when souls were tired enough to speak their fears aloud. Maybe he had led us too far, they said. Maybe this time ambition had outgrown strategy. Men who'd once cheered for him with voices raw began to curse under their breath when no officers were near. For years he had been larger than life, but Moscow brought Napoleon to our level. Watching him struggle alongside us softened the awe I had carried for so long. But strangely, that didn't dull my loyalty. If anything, it made it more real. All commanders can lead when the skies are clear, I thought. Only a great one can keep walking when the storm nearly swallows him whole. Even if we fell further with each step, he still moved forward. Still, there were moments when his humanity was clearer than ever, and it made the cold feel sharper. I remember passing him one evening as we marched through a grove of trees. His breath came visible, just like the rest of us, puffing soft clouds into the air before the wind carried them away. His face looked pale, his posture slightly slumped despite the proud image of the horse beneath him. I wanted to look away, to preserve my idea of him as the son of Austerlitz, eternally triumphant. But war doesn't allow illusions to last. Moscow had burned those away like the fire consumed its wooden streets. At night, the wolves began to follow. They stayed out of sight during the day, lingering at a distance, but when darkness fell, you could hear them. Their howls carried over the snow, rising and falling in unison. At first, the sound blended in with the wind, but once you noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. It pierced through the trees, each cry a reminder that the dead and the barely living were close behind us. Those howls weren't like the songs we'd sung by campfires after victory, or the raucous cheers we'd roared as Napoleon addressed his troops. These sounds were colder, emptier. They were the voices of scavengers, waiting for one of us to fall. I'll never forget one night, sitting near a small fire with another soldier who had lost most of his fingers to frostbite. He stared into the flames, his face pale and motionless, shoulders hunched under a flimsy blanket. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The howls picked up again, closer this time, their eerie harmony tightening every sinew in my body. The sound might have chilled me before, but after Moscow, I think we had become as cold as the landscape itself. The march dragged on, and with every passing day, there were fewer of us. For every mile we covered, dozens of men simply disappeared. Into the snow, into the trees, into whatever fate awaited them when their bodies finally betrayed them. By the time we reached safety, the Grand Army was barely more than a shadow of what it had been. Once the pride of Europe, now reduced to skeletal figures, whose dead eyes stared quietly ahead as if unable to see where they were going. Sitting here now, with that memory circling back, I realized the cold of Russia did something that no battlefield had done before. It made me see him, Napoleon, not as a destiny, but as a man who had failed, who had misjudged, but who also bore the same weight of survival as the rest of us. So many of the men I marched with left parts of themselves behind on that frozen road, pieces of their bodies, fragments of their spirits, sometimes their very will to live. And yet we followed him. Through the fire of Austerlitz, into the ice of Moscow, we followed. The Mediterranean air felt like a different world. After the frozen death marches from Moscow and the endless muddy fields of Europe, Elba seemed almost unreal. The island stretched wide beneath the sun, its hills blanketed in olive groves and whispering pines. The waves lapped softly against golden shores, a rhythm so steady and calm it was hard to believe this same man, my emperor, once stood on the summit of empires. As soldiers, we were used to movement, to urgency. But here, exiles seemed to press pause on everything. Napoleon himself, however, carried on. He wasn't a man who knew how to stop. Elba's coastline was rugged, though softened by the sea breeze. When we first arrived, the island felt small, almost stifling after so many years of marching across massive continents. It was hard to believe this patch of land was his empire now. The crowds cheering his return to Paris felt like a distant echo. On some of the locals' faces you could see the curiosity, the whispers that followed him wherever he walked in Portoferraio. "Imagine an emperor here," I heard one fisherman murmur to his wife. He stayed polite, though his palms gripped the nets tighter. To them, Napoleon was no longer the conqueror of Europe. He was something to puzzle over, a man both larger than life and shrunken by his fate. Napoleon didn't sit still. Almost immediately, he started changing the island. He noticed the rocky roads and sparse farmland the moment we disembarked. As always, his mind zeroed in on details others might ignore. He supervised improvements to the streets, the defences, even the storage warehouses along the coastline. The long-abandoned Forte Stella took his attention for weeks, its crumbling walls rebuilt under his orders, until the structure stood ready for any sudden invasion, however unlikely. It made me think of his early days, back when Toulon was his proving ground, when he was just a general who could outmaneuver anything thrown his way. He still had that same energy, though the power he once wielded had been reduced now to this single place. At first glance, he adapted well. His health seemed better almost immediately, as though that sea air replaced the stress and exhaustion that had ground him down over the years. His steps outdoors quickened, and the weariness that had plagued him during the campaigns seemed to fade. We would accompany him on long walks through the olive trees, stepping through the dusty paths leading out to the island's edges, where cliffs fell sharply into the impossibly blue waters. He would stop along the way, pointing to some modest farmhouse, discussing crop yields or irrigation systems with the local farmers. I realized then, it didn't matter where he was. Napoleon was Napoleon. Movement, construction, progress, these things gave him purpose, even here on his miniature empire of exile. Still, the island didn't erase the weight of defeat. Even in his busiest moments, the shadow of what was lost lingered. His official residence in Portoferraio had an elegance to it, but it wasn't the palaces of France or the grandeur of Moscow. He spent time renovating it, selecting pieces to decorate the chambers with care. I recall one room in particular. He had it decorated in the style of Egypt, as though he were reaching back to his days in Cairo, to a time when his star had been rising. He even set aside a suite of rooms for Marie-Louise and their son. The furniture was carefully chosen, and the walls carried ornaments meant to welcome them. But the halls remained silent. No letters came from Austria. No carriages bearing his family arrived. Time marched on without them. It was a quiet kind of heartbreak to watch him wait, to hear him dictate letters to her, his voice carefully composed, each word carrying the hope that she might change her mind. His love for his son never wavered, his words about the boy always tender, but that love wasn't enough to bring them here. There were rumors, whispers that she had already moved on, that she had no interest in joining her husband in exile. If he knew those rumors, he gave no sign. But sometimes, late at night, I noticed how long he would stare at the correspondence scattered across his desk, his pen still in his hand, unmoving. For all his work and optimism, there was no denying the humiliation Elba represented. He had once controlled nations. Paris had been his city, the seat of an empire whose influence stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. But here, his resources and subjects numbered barely more than a few thousand. It was absurd in many ways, and yet he never acted as though it were beneath him. To the people of Elba, he was their emperor just as much as he had been for the continent. He met with local officials, listened to their concerns about grain shortages or fishing disputes, and treated these matters with the same gravity as he had foreign diplomacy years earlier. I often thought of how a leader could shrink to meet his circumstances. Napoleon never did. Even with these distractions, there was something restless in him that even he couldn't shake. At night, as the stars spread across the Mediterranean sky like spilled silver, I sometimes caught him outside, walking alone in the quiet. His silhouette against the backdrop of the sea had none of the fanfare that once surrounded him. He was just a man in a greatcoat, looking out over an expanse of water that stretched toward France. When we spoke, his words were often measured, his tone reflective. One evening, as our footsteps crunched over the gravel paths leading back to the villa, I asked him whether he ever truly saw himself staying here. He stopped walking for a moment and looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between humor and regret. Empires are never built to rest, he said. He didn't have to explain further. The exile could only ever be temporary. News from beyond the island reached him in steady streams. Reports arrived from France, carried on small boats that docked in the evenings. We would gather to hear them. Much of it revolved around the monarchy, Louis XVIII, and his faltering grasp on popular support. They described the wavering loyalty of the army, of whispers among the French people, who had grown disillusioned with their new king. From Napoleon's expression, he was always reading more than the words on the page. Each report wasn't just information, it was a path, potential stepping stones toward what might come next. I could sense something building in him, day by day. Still, there were lighter moments. His family visited, at least some of them. Letizia, his mother, maintained a quiet strength, though I often wondered how much seeing her son in exile truly cost her. Pauline, his sister, brought an air of light-heartedness to the island. She was vibrant, always laughing, always finding ways to draw some humanity back into the long days. Their presence seemed to anchor him, even if briefly. In their company, there were small glimpses of the man he had been before ambition and war had subsumed everything. Elba wasn't a prison, but it wasn't freedom either. It was a waiting room, suspended between the greatness behind him and the fragile hopes ahead. One afternoon, as construction hammering echoed faintly from the fort nearby, he and I sat, overlooking the sea. He seemed unusually still that day, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Tell me," he said suddenly, "when you first followed me, did you foresee this?" The question caught me off guard. I chose my words carefully, but before I could reply, he turned slightly and smiled, a thin, knowing smile. Neither did I. Those moments of candor reminded me why we stayed, why so many of us, despite everything, continued to follow him. It wasn't fear, it was faith. Faith, not in an emperor, but in a man who, no matter where he stood, carried an unshakable certainty in himself. That certainty wasn't always comforting. It could overwhelm, it could burn those who stood near it. But it was also magnetic, impossible to ignore. The warmth of Elba had softened some of the edges I had seen in Russia, but the fire was still there, smouldering beneath the calm. It had never gone out. I see that clearly now. He adjusted to exile because he had no other choice. He built roads and forts, gave laws to new people, and worked as if this tiny island was a world in itself. But deep down, it was nothing more than preparation. Elba was never meant to contain him, not forever. I think he always knew the story wasn't finished. Ma. As the days passed, and winter gave way to the first hints of spring, there was a shift I couldn't name at the time. Not just in the air, but in him. The waiting, it seemed, was finally at an end. The day he left Elba felt like the calm before a storm. A storm that would shake the world one last time. We slipped away in the middle of February, the cold air biting at our faces as the small flotilla crossed the sea under cover of night. It wasn't the armies that worried us at first, but the British ships patrolling nearby. One sighting, one stray cannonball, and the return of Napoleon Bonaparte would have been over before it began. Every soldier aboard knew the risks, yet no one spoke of retreat. We were bound to his gamble, as much by loyalty as curiosity. What kind of man dares return from exile with nothing but faith in his name and the possibility of an impossible second chance? Belmont. We landed on the French coast in early March without fanfare. The sea had coldly let us disembark, but the land itself seemed hesitant to greet us. The villages we passed in those first days watched in quiet uncertainty. A few faces peeked from windows. Farmers stopped mid-plough to stare, but no one cheered. No one threw open their gates. It was as though the ground didn't yet recognize the man treading its soil. He moved among us calmly, his steps steady as he surveyed the towns, the horizon, everything. "They will see soon enough," he murmured to me one evening, after most of the camp had settled. His face was illuminated by the low light of a campfire. The lines around his mouth deepened with age, but even then, there was something in his eyes, an assurance that radiated far beyond the silence that surrounded us. We avoided any major roads, winding through the rugged hills and valleys of Provence. It seemed strange, deliberately stepping away from the pathways worn deep by centuries of travel. But he knew his intent, and of course, had his strategy. "It's not about strength," he told an officer at the head of our column as we marched through a route lined with slate-colored cliffs. "Victory here does not lie in muskets or sabers. These are matters of hearts." He wasn't here to seize power, not yet. He was here to be welcomed back to it. The pivot came near Grenoble. There were rumblings. The garrison was preparing to confront us. Orders sent directly from Paris by the King's men. As we approached their stationed troops, blue-coated, rifles in hand, their faces all too familiar, tension spread through our ranks. Would they shoot? Would they hold the line? Could this be an end almost before it began? Napoleon, seemingly impervious, dismounted and strode toward them. He walked alone, his greatcoat only barely sheltering him from the wind, his hat set at a slight angle. Without hesitation, he threw open the coat and pointed to his chest. "Here I am," he declared, his voice sounding clear and steady against the valley walls. "If any among you would shoot your emperor, do so now." The moment stretched, suspended and silent. Then the impossible happened. A cheer, not of defiance but recognition. Muskets lowered as soldiers began breaking into a run. They surrounded him, embraced him, some weeping openly. The tide turned in that instant. The banners of the Bourbons flew just moments before, but by the time laughter and cries rose into the air, they had already been discarded. Men gathered the tricolour from wherever they could find it, fastening it to their rifles with makeshift cords. "Vive l'Empereur!" They roared so loudly that day it seemed the echoes reached all the way to Paris. What began as whispers became waves. News of his return spread ahead, carried by riders, by tumbling rumours whispered in taverns and town markets. Each village we entered brought more supporters. They leaned out the upper windows of their modest homes, calling his name, tossing flowers into the street below. Farmers abandoned their ploughs to walk beside us, their children following alongside, clutching makeshift flags, some barely old enough to understand who he was, but who cheered nonetheless. It was as if France remembered its pulse again, awakening from years of imposed quiet under the weight of monarchy. Cheering crowds surrounded us the closer we drew to Paris, and within our ranks there was a new energy. Even the weary soldiers, those who had hardened themselves during the bleak marches in the past, began to laugh again, finding strength in those massive swells of support. In one town, a young boy rushed toward him, clutching a folded piece of paper. Napoleon reached down and took it, unfolding it with patient care. The paper was old, the ink faded, but it was a drawing of an eagle, a reminder of the empire, left behind but never fully extinguished. He chuckled softly, tucking it into his coat and murmuring, "A loyal bird, always." The speed with which others turned to him astounded even me. Garrisons meant to block his advance threw in their lot almost immediately, switching allegiances without muskets firing a single shot. Battle was unnecessary when belief travelled faster than orders. Officers, men who had sworn loyalty to the Bourbons less than a year earlier, flocked to his side. They couldn't resist the pull. To serve Napoleon was not about duty alone. It was about being part of something larger than yourself. He seemed to remind those around him what they could be, what France could be, if only they followed him once more. As triumphant as it was, there was unease bubbling under the surface as the march continued. Could this truly hold? Could the unity we saw as we strode down narrow roads lined with cheering villagers survive the realities ahead? There would be more than cheering crowds between him and securing France again. Already word reached us about the Allies. Austria, Prussia, Britain. They were mobilizing, sharpening their swords for Napoleon's second reign. Or what they were determined would be his briefest rule yet, had the shape of a last stand. Napoleon's gaze burned brighter than I had ever seen it when he addressed the soldiers one night in the weeks to come. "France will rise again," he declared. His voice rang steady, deliberate, but beneath it, I could hear time rushing forward like an unstoppable tide. Even belief, even loyalty could only move so fast before the weight of fate caught up, and fate wasn't far now. The road ahead, no matter how powerful it seemed tonight, led directly to Waterloo. The morning of Waterloo carried a weight that every man could feel, even as clouds began to gather above the open fields. Rain from the night before had turned the soil into a thick mud that clung to boots and wheels, slowing the movements of men and machines alike. The battlefield stretched out before us, a patchwork of wheat fields, ridges and farms. Looking across the expanse, it was impossible not to sense the magnitude of what was about to happen. For all his experience, even Napoleon seemed preoccupied as he surveyed the terrain, his telescope fixed on the British and Allied troops arrayed against us. The stakes, the history of it all, hung heavy in the damp air. This was the last chance, the Empire's last chance. The first sound of the day was cannon fire. At Napoleon's command, the artillery opened up, a deafening roar that rippled through our lines. Smoke rose quickly, swallowing sections of the battlefield in a pale haze, and the ground at our feet shook with each blast. It wasn't long before the air filled with the same brutal hail of musket balls and grape shot that I had seen so many times before. Men braced themselves, their bodies taut as they waited for orders to march. Ahead of us, the focus wasn't on the main army yet, but on Hougoumont, a farmhouse that became the centre of attention early in the battle. The French, led by Jerome Bonaparte, launched wave after wave at its gates, their shouts and musket fire echoing through the thick orchard trees surrounding the estate. For hours, the fighting there raged without pause, a fierce struggle where every inch seemed to require a lifetime to gain. But as the day wore on, it became clear that capturing Hougoumont wasn't going to break Wellington's line. Every attack drained our energy, pulling men and resources away from the decisive points of the battlefield. Around midday, attention shifted to the centre as Marshal Ney took charge. Napoleon had wanted to break Wellington's forces, to exploit weaknesses where they showed, but it was Ney who saw an opportunity, or believed he did. He sent forward d'Erlon's infantry corps, a massive force of 17,000 soldiers. They advanced behind a thunderous bombardment, the air filled with the scent of gunpowder and the muffled cries of orders being shouted above the din. In perfect discipline, row after row of French soldiers moved toward the British lines, their bayonets catching flashes of light from the ever-dimming sun. Watching from where I stood, it was almost mesmerizing, this spectacle of human precision marching directly into chaos. But Wellington was waiting. Apparently stationary British regiments sprung into action as the French crested the ridge. Hidden from sight until the last moment, their volleys ripped into our men, followed by the surge of Highlander regiments charging in counterattack. The ground turned into a grim theatre of falling bodies, shattered muskets, and cries that blended into one relentless sound. Despite their bravery, d'Erlon's corps was pushed back, the advance faltering in the face of an enemy that seemed immovable. With every step backward, hope seemed to waver, and the silence that followed that failed attack was almost more unbearable than the fighting. By mid-afternoon, desperation began to creep in. Napoleon himself remained composed, though I could tell he sensed the shifting tide. What followed was a moment of hesitation that cost us dearly. Ney, caught in the heat of battle, believed he saw the British wavering. From his vantage point, their lines appeared unsteady, and he suspected a retreat was imminent. Without waiting for confirmation, he ordered a massive cavalry charge, one of the largest I had ever seen in my years under Napoleon. Thousands of horsemen, sabres raised high, thundered across the field, their figures distorted by the smoke and mud flying up around them. It was a spectacle that stirred something primal, even as I watched from afar. The sound of hooves pounding against the sodden ground was almost deafening. Dust and smoke rolled together as the cavalry surged toward the British lines with unrelenting force. But Wellington's men were ready. They formed squares, dense, compact groups of infantry that presented bayonets in every direction. The horses reared back, unable to break through the human fortress ahead of them. Again and again they charged, flanking, retreating, regrouping, and charging once more. For 3 hours, the cavalry struggled against those immovable squares. Watching from the ridge, it was evident what Ney had failed to see. The British line wasn't breaking. They were enduring. By this point, the battlefield had devolved into a fragmented nightmare. The fields around La Haye-Sainte were drenched, not just in rainwater, but in blood and churned soil. The farm at its centre became another desperate focal point, with both sides pouring men into its defences. The King's German Legion, holed up inside, fought with a ferocity that defied their dwindling ammunition and numbers. When the French finally captured it, the victory felt hollow. It had cost us men we could no longer afford to lose, and by then, the Prussians were closing in. The sight of them, the Prussian reinforcements appearing on the right flank, sapped whatever faint confidence remained among the ranks. The timing was perfect for Wellington and devastating for us. Napoleon had tried to send reinforcements to counter Blucher's men earlier in the day, but delays, miscommunications, and the sheer unpredictability of war had left that flank exposed. From where I stood, I could see the black uniforms moving in waves, their artillery now joining the symphony of destruction that filled the air. There was no longer any illusion of victory. We were outnumbered, outflanked, and outmaneuvered. Even as the battle tipped irrevocably against us, Napoleon made one final gamble. He ordered the Old Guard, his most loyal and seasoned troops, to advance. These men, who had stood tall at Austerlitz and survived the horrors of Moscow, marched forward with the unwavering confidence that defined their reputation. They were a symbol as much as a force. Their presence meant to inspire the shattered remnants of our army. As they moved, even the earth seemed to hold its breath. Yet, what awaited them was not glory, but the same grim reality every other regiment had already faced that day. They clashed with the Allied forces near the British centre, but the resistance they met was overwhelming. I will never forget the moment the first volley struck the Guard. It was like a wall of sound and fury, muskets firing in synchronized waves that ripped through the ranks of those who had been called invincible. The British Guards Brigade, hidden in the tall wheatgrass, unleashed devastating volleys that seemed to shake the ground itself. And then it happened, the unthinkable. The Old Guard began to fall back. Step by reluctant step, they retreated, their tight formation unraveling under intense fire. "La garde recule!" someone shouted nearby. The word sent a tremor through the French lines. The Guard had never retreated before, and its fall signaled an end more definitive than any cannonball could. From there, the collapse was unstoppable. The French ranks disintegrated as men fled in all directions, pursued by the now united Prussian and British troops. The battlefield became a sea of panic and despair, cannon fire replaced by the relentless sound of retreating boots and desperate cries. Only a few pockets of resistance remained, and even they were swept away with time. Napoleon himself, watching from his command post, stood silent, his face etched with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't rage or disbelief, but something quieter, resignation. As the sun set over Waterloo, the field became a scene of utter devastation. The mud now swallowed everything. Bodies, broken sabres, shattered wheels. Fires still burned at the edges of the farms, their light flickering weakly against the darkness settling in. Amid it all, I couldn't look away from the sheer loyalty of those who fought to the very end. Soldiers threw themselves into battle long after hope had vanished, not for survival, but for the man who had led them. That kind of faith doesn't crumble easily, even in the face of total defeat. Walking through the aftermath, the weight of it pressed down harder than the mud beneath my boots. To live through this, it felt like the world itself had shifted, like something vital had been lost. Those men, those moments of brilliance carved across the years, all seemed impossibly far away now. An empire had fallen, not on paper or in some distant treaty room, but here, in the rain-soaked fields outside a Belgian village. The Old Guard's retreat was the symbol that stayed with me most. Those men, proud, defiant, unshakable, were not invincible after all, and perhaps neither was the man who led them. I still see them sometimes in memory, their uniforms ragged, their gazes holding the glint of defiance even as the enemy closed in. It felt like the end of something larger than any one of us, a moment that would echo in history long after we were gone. The weight of loyalty doesn't come from a single moment. It builds slowly over years. Every battle fought, every victory shared, every loss endured together. For me, it didn't begin on some grand battlefield or in the presence of a roaring crowd. It began quietly, with the first command he ever gave me. The first time he turned that calculating gaze in my direction and trusted me with a task. Just one simple order. Yet even then, I remember thinking that this man was unlike anyone I had ever served. His words carried a force, a pull that made action feel not only necessary but inevitable. And from that moment, my loyalty was given, never knowing how deeply it would be tested. When I consider it now, I think loyalty to Napoleon was never truly about him as a man, not in the beginning. It was about what he represented. After years of chaos, wars tearing apart the land, and a revolution that promised change but delivered blood, Napoleon offered something extraordinary: stability, order, and perhaps for the first time, the thought that France could be great again. To serve him wasn't just to work under a commander, it was to believe in something bigger than yourself. But what happened to that belief when everything started to fall apart? Even here, now, surrounded by the silence that followed Waterloo, I still feel the shadow of his presence, as if his voice could reach across any battlefield. No matter how quiet, that voice had carried us through so much. I saw it move soldiers on the eve of their greatest fears, saw it whip crowds into ecstasy at the height of his power. And yet, loyalty didn't end at Austerlitz, where the sun rose over a world we had just reshaped. It didn't falter during the frozen nightmare of Moscow either. It endured in places like Elba, where the grand vision of the empire was reduced to a rugged island, where the only empire left was built out of memory and hope. I ask myself now, was it the man? Was it his brilliance? Or was it what he made us believe about ourselves? At Austerlitz, under those bright skies, I would have thought loyalty was about the victories, about standing beside someone when they are invincible. How could it be anything else, when cheers filled the air and you felt as though history itself bent to your will? But then came the storm, the defeats, the retreat from Moscow's ashes. It was there, in the brittle cold, that loyalty meant something different. It wasn't built on triumph or grandeur. It was built on the way he endured, the way his shadow stretched across even the bleakest night. To serve Napoleon was to live in constant light and shadow. He was the sun at Austerlitz. His presence felt golden, warm, and irresistible. There was clarity to those days when every command, every forward march, felt like it carried the weight of destiny. But he was the storm, too. I saw it swirl in his eyes when the Prussians closed in at Waterloo, when even his strategic brilliance could not halt the cracks spreading through our lines. He carried the storm with him on quieter days as well, when letters from his wife stopped coming, or when an entire camp awaited his next move, as if the universe itself depended on it. He burned brightly in triumph, but his fury at setbacks cut just as deeply. That fire, so invigorating when directed outward, could scorch everything around him when he turned it inward. To follow him was to understand this duality, and to live alongside both. As I sit now in this eerie calm, I realize loyalty isn't as simple as I once believed. Was it truly for him, or was it for France? Was it for the strength I thought I could see in him? Or perhaps it was for the way he convinced each of us that we mattered, that we were part of history itself. When a man like that looks at you, his gaze steady and unreadable, and tells you that you are important to the building of something greater, how can you refuse? The loyalty wasn't blind. If anything, it was sharper, clearer, shaped by the hardships that came alongside the victories. I think of the nights when the campfires burned low and the men sat together exhausted and hollow-eyed. Those moments, too, carried their own kind of loyalty. It wasn't just to Napoleon, but to each other. Battles seem like endless noise when histories retell them, But amidst the chaos are the moments no one outside that circle could ever see. Soldiers sharing their last ration of bread, someone quietly mending a comrade's uniform because it was all they had left to shield them from the cold. I remember these smaller sacrifices more than any proclamation of glory. And in those small, human acts, loyalty carried weight far greater than ambition or victory ever could. Sometimes, I think our devotion came from something almost intangible, a rhythm, an inevitability. It's not that he asked for it directly, he didn't need to. Being near him made you feel as though you were part of something unstoppable, as though the march of history hinged on what you would do next. Even when doubt crept in, when defeat seemed like it might overshadow everything he had built, that feeling, the pull of purpose, never left. I saw it in the eyes of men during those last desperate hours at Waterloo, their uniforms mud-soaked and faces wearied by years of war, yet their hands gripping their swords as if still reaching for the impossible. But now, with the empire crumbled and the sun long set, I ask, what was left of loyalty when the victories were no longer there to sustain it? I think back to his exile on Elba, the way he walked among the olive trees, speaking as if the island were as grand as any capital he had commanded. Even while diminished, he carried himself with the same conviction, as if all of Europe was still watching and waiting. His certainty gave the rest of us certainty. Did we believe so fiercely in him, or did we simply want to believe in something that wouldn't falter? No matter the odds, for me, the two became impossible to separate. As the fire crackles faintly now, casting weak shadows against the damp ground, I understand something I hadn't before. Napoleon was human. As much as he seemed unbreakable, there were cracks in the foundation, moments of hesitation, missteps, bursts of frustration that we could see but never spoke of. And yet that humanity didn't diminish him. It made him more real. Serving him in victory was intoxicating, yes, but serving him in defeat revealed truth about both him and myself. Perhaps loyalty isn't about never questioning. It's about standing by someone, even when you know they can fail. The memory that lingers more than any battlefield is one of the quieter ones. Late on a warm night in Elba, the sky thick with stars, I watched as he sat at his desk, papers scattered before him. He stayed motionless for a long time, his gaze distant but thoughtful. Maybe he was writing to his son, or maybe his mind wandered farther back, to the days when he had commanded the loyalty of millions. In that silence, I saw not a fallen emperor, but a man who refused to yield to despair. He built again, even in exile, because building was who he was. It is easy for history to simplify men like him, to paint them as symbols of triumph or warning. But loyalty isn't simple. It's messy, layered, and contradictory. For me, it stretched between awe and exhaustion, between pride and the ache of loss. Sitting here now, I think the truest loyalty isn't about blind devotion. It's knowing someone fully, their greatness, their flaws, and choosing to follow them anyway. What does it mean to serve someone whose star has fallen? It means accepting the cracks as part of the whole. It means loving not just the light, but also the shadow. Napoleon taught us all what it was to burn brightly, to reach for the extraordinary, even if the fire consumed parts of us along the way. And now, even in defeat, I cannot regret the choice to stand in his orbit. The embers of the fire before me seem to dim further as the wind stirs. I know the world has already moved on. The empire is gone. The brilliance faded. But I find no bitterness lingering inside me. Instead, there is peace. Peace in the knowledge that loyalty is not about success, but about staying until the very end. Now, all that remains is the final farewell. The moment I say goodbye not just to him, but to who I was in his service. The fire is nearly out now, its glowing embers shrinking into the dark soil beneath them. The battlefield is silent, yet it feels alive in its own way. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of things left unsaid. Of all the lives that passed here today, I sit alone beside the dimming light, gazing past its weak glow toward the shapes of the land now cloaked in shadows. Somewhere in the distance, where men once stood to hold the last defences. A faint breeze rustles through the broken wheat fields. It carries the smell of damp earth, gunpowder, and rain-slicked metal. In my mind, I imagine him standing here just a few paces away. Not the emperor, not the symbol of France, or the leader whose name once echoed across Europe. Just him, the man who shaped my life. A figure that seems both familiar and distant now, as if the events of today have carved a space between us I'll never quite cross. He's silent, but I can almost see the weight in his eyes, the heavy knowledge of what this day has taken. As I sit here, I speak to him. Not aloud, but in the quiet language of memory shared between those who have walked the same long road. You taught me what it meant to follow greatness, I begin. Though I'm not sure if this farewell is for him or for the version of myself that once believed there would be no end. From the very first day, when you stood with that fire in your voice and that certainty in your gaze, you made me believe. You made all of us believe. My thought wavers for a moment, caught between pride and sadness. I thought you were invincible. The sky above stretches wide, punctured by faint points of starlight. The moon is high tonight, its pale glow casting a faint sheen across the uneven hills that slope away into the horizon. It looks peaceful now, but I can still see what the daylight revealed. Shattered wheels, torn banners buried in the mud, and rows of men who will never rise again. I know the details of this battlefield will fade in my memory eventually, as so many others have. But tonight it feels impossible to let them go. You made us feel like we were part of something eternal, I whisper. That we weren't just men, but something more, a piece of history in motion. The words hang between us, as if waiting for the echo that never comes. What he created wasn't just an empire or an army, it was a sense of belonging, of being part of a purpose so vast it made the world seem small. And yet, tonight, as the remnants of the fire flicker and vanish, it is hard not to feel how fragile it all was. How fleeting. I think back to the moments when that purpose burned brightest. The cheers of the men at Austerlitz still echo in my mind, the way the sun rose over that field, bathing everything in warm golden light, as if the heavens themselves had ordained our victory. How proud I felt in those days, marching behind a man who seemed to bend the world to his will. You gave us something no one else could, I say, hope. Out of the ashes of revolution, you built something new, and we followed without question, because you made it feel like every step forward was the right one. But the stars above tonight remind me of other nights, colder ones, when that purpose felt farther away. My body shivers slightly as my mind shifts to Moscow, to that long road of ice and despair. Even when the air froze our breath and the wolves howled in the distance, we followed you, I continue. We watched you endure. For all your faults, you never stopped moving forward. And maybe that's why we stayed, because if you could bear it, so could we. Those words settled deep, touching something raw inside me. There was power in his resilience, a force that demanded you not just respect him, but believe in him, even when everything around him began to crack and fall away. And yet, even kings fall, even empires crumble. The fire hisses faintly before going almost completely still, its warmth fading from the edges of my coat. The truth, I admit softly, leaning forward as if you might still hear me out there in the shadowed fields, is that I don't know who I will be without you. For all the battles we fought, for all the marches and victories and defeats, being your soldier felt like all I ever was. My fingers brush against the frayed edge of my cuff, idly tracing a rip I hadn't noticed earlier. What happens, I pause, when the man who led you to the center of the world has no world left to command? The thought weighs heavy, accompanied by images of my fellow soldiers, the men still limping across distant roads, seeking refuge that may never come. I wonder what they're telling themselves tonight, if they're making sense of what we've lost, or if they're simply too tired to think at all. I imagine them scattered across the land, resting beneath makeshift shelters or beside low flames like mine. Did they find their purpose wrapped in him too, or had they hidden their doubts until now, burying them beneath duty and faith? My gaze shifts upward again, lingering on a cluster of stars, faintly visible through a patchwork of clouds. Maybe this is how it's meant to end, I murmur, quieter now. Not to him, but to the night itself. Even the brightest star burns out sooner or later. But that doesn't mean the light wasn't worth following. There's a strange peace in that, a kind of fragile acceptance that hadn't been there before. Perhaps that's why I can sit here, now, without anger or regret, only the ache of knowing it's over.
I close my eyes for a moment, letting the cold air settle into my lungs, carrying me back to the sound of his voice. Even in defeat, it stayed steady. Even when the lines broke around us, when the fateful order to retreat was finally given, he still stood upright. I wonder now if he had already made peace with it, if he knew this was the final chapter and had chosen to face it head-on, without succumbing to the desperation that rattled the rest of us. "You faced the end as you taught us to face everything," I say to the imagined figure I still see standing there. Quiet, dignified, utterly unrelenting. Left to add, I rise slowly from where I'm sitting, brushing mud from the hem of my coat and glancing once more at the blackened remains of the fire. As I stand, the battlefield seems to stretch endlessly in every direction. A stray breeze stirs the ashes at my feet, yet its touch feels gentle, as if the land itself is letting us go. "Goodbye, my friend," I whisper at last, the words catching slightly as they leave my lips. He wasn't just my emperor, though he will always be remembered that way by history. He was my leader, my guiding star, and in some complicated way that words will never fully capture, the man who shaped me into who I am. The night doesn't respond. There's no sign, no sense of closure, just the soft hum of the wind and the faint glow of the stars. But that's all right. This goodbye doesn't need a reply. It lives in the act itself, in the moment of standing here and letting go, not of the man, but of the version of myself that existed in his shadow. As I start to walk away, the ground beneath my boots feels firmer, the sky above just a little brighter. I think of everything we've shared, the triumphs, the losses, the lessons that will never fade. And while the road before me lies uncertain, I carry with me the memories of a man who dared to believe he could reshape the world, and for a time made all of us believe it too. Even in the quiet of defeat, Napoleon's story remains a testament to the human drive to shape history. The men who followed him didn't just march through battles. They walked a fragile line between loyalty and ambition, forging a connection to something larger than themselves. Waterloo marked the end of an era, but it began a legacy as powerful as any empire. History is crafted not by victories alone, but by the stories of those who lived them. As the aide steps away from the battlefield, he carries not just loss, but the memory of serving greatness, and that will endure longer than empires.